It was the kind of morning that gleamed with corporate perfection, 8 tall glass towers reflecting the skyline, polished shoes echoing on marble floors, assistants balancing lattes and tablets as if rehearsing a ritual. Inside Northwell Capital's 42&D floor conference room, confidence wasn't just expected, it was performed. The atmosphere was charged with ambition, the sort of tense optimism that precedes major financial announcements. Every executive around the long mahogany table was poised, alert, rehearsed, every detail of posture and tone measured for power. At the center of it all sat Adrian Lane, the company's 34-year-old chief executive, a man known for his precision, his calm voice, and his reputation for never hesitating. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his cufflinks understated but unmistakably expensive. To anyone watching, he was the image of control. Yet, under the gloss of confidence, something else flickered: a tension in his jaw, a faint delay in his reactions, the barely perceptible pause before he agreed with the point. Across from him, Chief Strategy Officer Elodie Benson clicked through a flawless presentation. Her voice was firm, her gestures confident as she announced that the latest expansion model projected a 92% chance of success. Around the room, heads nodded, there were murmurs of approval, a few smiles exchanged. Success was contagious, and in that room, nobody wanted to be the one to question it. The illusion of agreement felt safer than the risk of doubt. Near the far end of the table sat Chantel Carter, a junior financial analyst barely visible behind a stack of reports. She had learned to exist quietly, blending into the background of meetings where words mattered less than image. But as Elodie spoke, Chantel's eyes narrowed. She watched Adrian, not Elodie. His expression was calm, but his gaze lingered too long on one graph. When the numbers shifted on the screen, his hand clenched ever so slightly before he masked it with a small nod. To everyone else, it was nothing. To Chantel, it was everything. She recognized that look as the silent panic of someone pretending to understand. For a moment, she looked away, her chest tightening with empathy. She knew what it meant to fake confidence, to fear being exposed for not knowing enough. But this wasn't a college presentation or a team report. This was a projection worth hundreds of millions. And the thought of someone at the top not fully grasping the numbers behind those decisions sent a ripple of unease through her. As the meeting ended, polite applause filled the room. Adrian congratulated Elodie, thanked the team, and announced that the proposal would move forward. People left buzzing with the thrill of progress, unaware that beneath the polished performance, a quiet uncertainty had taken root. Chantel lingered for a moment, looking at the frozen graphs on the screen. The data looked right, but something about the assumptions didn't sit well. A single formula in the risk model seemed off, barely noticeable, but enough to trigger her curiosity. That evening, long after the others had gone home, she sat at her desk, the only light in the darkened office coming from her monitor. The city outside was alive with the glow of late-night taxis and the hum of endless movement, but inside, everything was still. She began to retrace the data, line by line, running calculations quietly, methodically. What she found made her breath catch. The error wasn't small. It was buried deep in the financial model, hidden under layers of projections, but its impact was massive. If left unchecked, it would cost the company over $120 million. For several minutes she just sat there, staring at the screen. Her hands trembled slightly, her pulse racing. She wanted to believe she was wrong, that she'd miscalculated or misunderstood something. But she hadn't. The numbers were clear. The report that had earned applause that morning was built on a critical flaw. She imagined the fallout if it came to light, the embarrassment, the chaos, the consequences for everyone involved. And she thought of Adrian Lane as the man who had nodded along as though he'd seen the truth, when maybe, deep down, he hadn't. There was a part of her that wanted to stay silent. After all, who was she to challenge the people who led the company? A junior analyst contradicting the executive team could easily be dismissed, or worse, punished. Yet the other part of her, the one that believed numbers don't lie, couldn't let it go. She had spent her life believing that integrity mattered, even when nobody noticed. And now, that belief demanded something of her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time before she began typing. The words came slowly, simply. When you need the truth, not the show. Attached were her recalculations, her findings, and the corrected projections. No name, no signature, no trace of who had written it. Just the data, unfiltered, undeniable. When she finally pressed send, she felt both terrified and relieved. The email disappeared into the digital void, heading toward a man who had built his career on certainty. Chantel leaned back, closing her eyes. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew this: silence protects comfort, not truth. And sometimes, one quiet act of honesty in a world of performances can start a storm that no one sees coming. When morning came, the email sat in Adrian Lane's inbox like a whisper waiting to be heard. He opened it before his first coffee, expecting another routine update from the analytics team. But what he found instead made his breath pause. The subject line was short, almost cryptic: when you need the truth, not the show. There was no sender name, no greeting, only a series of recalculated figures and a note that outlined the discrepancy too large to ignore. For several minutes he just stared at the screen, the words blurring as the implications settled in. If this data was correct, the company's flagship expansion plan, the same one he had confidently approved, was flawed from its foundation. Adrian scrolled through the attachments, running the numbers himself. The anonymous analyst had been meticulous. Every assumption was backed by evidence, every risk scenario accounted for, every conclusion logically sound. And at the bottom of the report, a single sentence stood out in bold: projected loss if executed as planned, $120 million. It wasn't an opinion, it was a fact, cold and mathematical. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city below. The skyline looked as solid as ever, but in that moment, the ground beneath his career felt fragile. For years, Adrian had built his image on precision, as a man who never faltered, never doubted, never hesitated. Investors trusted him because he made complexity look simple. Yet now, someone had uncovered a mistake that could destroy that illusion. Worse, they had done so anonymously, as if afraid to speak their name. He couldn't decide what unsettled him more: the error itself or the fear that had kept its discoverer hidden. By the time the morning meeting began, the tension in his chest had hardened into resolve. He walked into the boardroom carrying printed copies of the email and took his seat at the head of the table. Around him, the usual energy buzzed. They chatter about targets, projections, and the previous day's applause. Elodie Benson, ever composed, stood at the screen, preparing to present minor updates. She caught Adrian's expression and faltered slightly before recovering her smooth tone. As the presentation began, Adrian's eyes swept across the faces of his teammate, people who had built their careers on confidence and control. He wondered how many of them, like him, were pretending. When the charts faded, he cleared his throat and placed the anonymous report on the table. Someone within this company, he began evenly, has recalculated our risk assessment. The findings area broken bar different. I want to know who did this. The room went still. No one spoke, papers rustled faintly, and a few exchanged glances. Finally, Elodie gave a light laugh, the kind meant to diffuse tension while asserting superiority. Probably an intern trying to impress you, she said. Everyone wants to leave a mark these days. The others smiled politely, relieved by her tone. Adrian didn't. His gaze remained steady, but his voice softened. An intern who understands our models better than we do would be worth listening to. Across the table, a quiet movement caught his attention. A woman at the far end, one he barely recognized, was looking down, her fingers tightening on a pen. He remembered her name only vaguely from an organizational chart. You compiled the original data, didn't you? He asked. Her head lifted slightly. Yes, sir. Do these results match what you expected? He pressed. Her voice came small but steady. I'm sure the strategy team understands the analysis better than I do. It was a safe answer, the kind that protected jobs but buried truth. He recognized that kind of fear. It was the same fear that had once nearly ended his own career. Years ago, during his first major project, he had made a decision based on a model he didn't fully understand. The failure had cost millions and nearly cost him his position. Since then, he had vowed never to appear uncertain again. That vow had turned into armor, and now, that armor was cracking from the inside. The meeting ended with no confession, only a cloud of unease. Within 48 hours, A notice was circulated through the internal system. An analyst had been dismissed for data policy violations. It was corporate language for silence. The news didn't surprise anyone, though a few employees whispered that the dismissal had come too quickly. Adrian read the HR note twice before deleting it. Officially, it was just another personnel matter. Unofficially, he knew exactly what it was: the quiet erasure of integrity. That night, he sat in his office long after the lights had dimmed. The city shimmered outside. Indifferent to corporate politics, he opened the anonymous email again, rereading the words that had disrupted his perfect fate. Section 8. Every figure in that report still made sense. Every point was correct. Somewhere in his company, someone had risked everything to tell him the truth, and he had allowed that truth to be punished. The realization stung in a way he couldn't articulate. He thought of the employees who had watched him all these years, believing in his flawless certainty. He had given them the image of a man who always knew the answers, but now he saw the danger, and that image, how it suffocated honesty, how it made people afraid to question, how it rewarded silence over courage. The anonymous analyst hadn't just found an error, they had exposed a sickness in the culture he had created. As dawn approached, Adrian made a quiet decision. He would not let this end buried in bureaucracy. The numbers demanded correction, and the truth deserved acknowledgement. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, not confidence, but humility. It was the realization that leadership wasn't about appearing unbreakable, it was about allowing truth, however inconvenient, to speak. And somewhere beyond the corporate walls, someone had already spoken for him. The investor summit began with the kind of polished precision that defined Northwell Capital's public image. Every detail had been engineered to impress: crystal lighting, sleek branding, and the confident rhythm of executives rehearsed in success. Cameras flashed as investors and journalists filled the hall, waiting for reassurance that Northwell's next global venture would deliver the returns it promised. At the center of the stage stood Elodie Benson, radiant in her composure, projecting an authority so seamless it seemed unshakable. The numbers behind her glowed on the massive screen: 92% projected success, $200 million in anticipated investment, and a future painted in flawless certainty. Adrian Lane sat at the front, his expression calm but unreadable. Inside, however, his thoughts churned like a storm behind glass. He knew what those numbers hid: the fragile scaffolding of assumptions and exaggerations that one anonymous email had revealed. He also knew that in a few moments, everything built on those numbers would face its reckoning. For weeks, he had prepared himself for this confrontation, and still, the air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. Elodie's presentation unfolded like a performance she had mastered long ago. Each graph, each confident pause, each strategically timed smile drew nods from the crowd. The investors were leaning forward now, their attention sharpened by opportunity. When she concluded with the poised declaration, "This is not just growth, this is legacy," the applause came as expected, polite but full of belief. Then the ballroom doors opened. A hush spread like a ripple through the crowd. Adrian turned before anyone else did, recognizing the figure standing at the back even before her voice reached the microphone. Chantel Carter looked out of place among the suits and sheen, her modest blazer and steady eyes marking her as someone who hadn't come to impress but to be heard. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, her tone firm but controlled. "But before any funding decisions are finalized, there are discrepancies in the data that need to be addressed." The silence that followed was almost physical. Elodie's composure faltered just long enough to betray alarm before she recovered her smooth, cutting voice. "You're suspended," she hissed, "and this is a private event." "Security, please see." Adrian's voice broke through, calm and authoritative. "Let her speak." The command stopped everything. Security froze mid-step. The journalists leaned forward, sensing the story beneath the surface, and Chantel, whose hands had been trembling slightly, exhaled once and walked toward the stage. Each step was a choice, a refusal to retreat into invisibility. When she reached the screen, she connected her laptop without hesitation. Her presentation replaced Elodie's projections in an instant to the same data, but stripped of embellishment. "Our current models," she began, "were calculated using incomplete market data. The actual probability of success isn't 92%, As stated, it's closer to 48%, and if the expansion fails within its first fiscal year, projected losses could reach $120 million. A wave of murmurs swept the room. Investors exchanged looks, some skeptical, others alarmed. Elodie tried to interject, but Chantel continued, her voice gathering strength. The regulatory forecasts used were outdated. Consumer behavior models were inflated to support growth narratives that don't exist in the real market. These aren't opinions, they're numbers. And numbers don't lie, even when people do. For the first time, Elodie's confidence cracked completely. She turned to Adrian with disbelief, her tone rising. You're going to let her undermine everything we've built? She's a junior analyst, not a strategist. She doesn't understand the scale of fate. Adrian stood slowly, turning toward her and then to the investors. She understands the truth, he said simply. That's more than I can say for most of us. The room fell still again, all movement suspended. He walked to the stage, addressing the crowd now, his voice resonating with the kind of quiet authority that can only come from vulnerability. 3 weeks ago, I received an anonymous report correcting the errors in our official model. I traced it within hours. I knew who sent it, and I ignored it because I was afraid of how it would look if I admitted I didn't understand every detail myself. The confession rippled through the hall like an electric current. Journalists' fingers flew across keyboards. Elodie looked frozen in place, her carefully constructed reputation unraveling. Adrian continued, his tone unwavering. 5 years ago, I made a similar mistake that cost the company nearly $40 million because I was too proud to ask for clarification. I built my career on never showing weakness. But this analyst, he gestured toward Chantel, risked her own career to give me the truth I was too afraid to face. Her work didn't just save Northwell from financial disaster, it saved me from becoming a leader who valued appearance over integrity. No one spoke. It was not a moment of drama but of gravity, the kind that reshapes rooms, reputations, and the people within them. Chantel stood beside him, still, unsure whether she'd just ruined or redeemed her future. Adrian turned toward her fully. Miss Carter, your courage has reminded us what leadership means. Thank you for not staying silent. Applause didn't come right away. It wasn't that kind of moment. But one by one, people began to clap. First a few investors, then the journalists, then nearly the entire room. The sound was subdued but sincere. Elodie stood off to the side, pale and wordless. She understood what it meant. The end of her power built on performance. When the summit adjourned, chaos followed. The questions, press flashes, hurried statements. But in the eye of it all, Adrian and Chantel stood quietly at the edge of the stage. Neither spoke for several long seconds, their silence saying more than words could. They had both been exposed in different ways, the one for fear, the other for dread, but in that exposure, something real had begun. For Chantel, the applause wasn't triumph, it was release. The years of invisibility, of holding back truth to protect fragile hierarchies, had ended. For Adrian, it was redemption, a reminder that strength wasn't built on control, but on the courage to be transparent. Together, in that moment, they both understood what the company had forgotten, that truth, once spoken, doesn't just challenge power, it redefines it. The following weeks unfolded like a quiet dawn, slow but full of meaning. The shock of the investor summit had rippled through every corner of Northwell capital, but what replaced fear wasn't chaos, it was clarity. For the first time in years, conversations inside the glass walls didn't sound like performances. People asked questions without apology. Executives double-checked data not out of suspicion, but respect. The company had shifted its success, and at the center of that shift was a woman who once believed her invisibility was her safety. Chantel Carter, head of data integrity, worked with a kind of focus that came not from ambition but from conviction. Her new department wasn't about policing, it was about rebuilding trust. Every morning she arrived early, greeted by analysts already deep in their spreadsheets, coffee cups balanced beside open laptops. She'd walk through the rows, stopping to listen, encouraging curiosity. If something doesn't make sense, question it, she'd remind them. Confusion isn't a weakness, it's the beginning of understanding. Those words began to echo through departments once silenced by hierarchy. Meetings became dialogues, not monologues. Presentations no longer ended with unquestioned applause. but thoughtful debate. It was uncomfortable, sometimes even messy, but it was real. Adrian Lane noticed the difference too. The CEO who once equated confidence with control now found strength in humility. He no longer filled silences with authority but allowed them to breathe with thought. In meetings, when someone admitted they didn't understand a model or projection, he would nod and say, "Let's learn together." That simple phrase became symbolic of Northwell's rebirth. The press soon caught wind of the transformation. Business publications that once praised the company's aggressiveness now praised its transparency. Headlines called it the quiet revolution of truth. Chantel never sought attention for her role in it. She declined interviews, preferring her work to speak for itself. Yet, within the company, her name became synonymous with courage. Employees spoke about her in the cafeteria, saying things like, "She made it okay to be honest," or "She proved that truth doesn't have to shout." For Chantel, the real victory was subtle, with the young intern who stopped her one afternoon to say, "I spoke up in a meeting today because I saw you do it first." That moment mattered more than any promotion. Adrian and Chantel developed a quiet rhythm in their collaboration. Their conversations were often brief but meaningful, two people who understood the language of restraint and integrity. He'd ask for her opinion on new initiatives, and she'd give it without softening the edges. Their mutual respect was built not on power but on honesty. In the evenings, when the building grew quiet and the city lights painted the skyline, Chantel would sometimes find Adrian still at his desk, revising reports or answering messages. They didn't always talk. Sometimes just being in the same space was enough, a reminder that leadership could be shared through presence, not authority. One late evening, Adrian called her into his office to show her the final draft of Northwell's new mission statement. It read, "We pursue growth through integrity, innovation through honesty, and leadership through listening." Chantel read it twice before looking up. "That's the company I'd want to work for," she said softly. Adrian smiled. "That's the company you helped create." It was a simple acknowledgement, but it carried the weight of redemption for him and for the institution that had almost lost its soul. As the months passed, Northwell's results improved, and not just financially but culturally. Employee retention increased, errors decreased, and innovation flourished because people no longer feared being wrong. They understood that mistakes were inevitable, deception was optional. The quarterly integrity reports became a core part of company meetings, and Chantel's presentations were now anticipated rather than dreaded. She delivered them with quiet authority, focusing not on blame but learning. Every chart and figure reflected her belief that data could be human when used with honesty. Outside the office, Chantel's life had changed too. She moved to a small apartment closer to the river, where she could walk after work and watch the city lights ripple across the water. The view reminded her that truth, like light, didn't need to conquer darkness, it only needed to exist to make it visible. On weekends, she volunteered at a local mentorship program, teaching young women about ethical leadership and decision-making. Many of them came from environments where silence was mistaken for survival. She told them gently, "Your voice matters, even when it shakes, especially when it shakes." Adrian often stopped by those sessions quietly, listening from the back. He never interrupted, only watched with a kind of pride that came not from ownership but gratitude. He understood now that leadership wasn't about commanding others to be brave, it was about creating spaces where bravery could exist. The following year, at the company's annual retreat, Adrian invited Chantel to speak. Standing before hundreds of employees, she looked calm, her voice steady but full of feeling. "We all wear masks," she said, "sometimes to survive, sometimes to belong. But the truth is, pretending to understand or agree only builds walls between us. What saved this company wasn't merely, it was a decision to stop performing and start listening. Because honesty doesn't destroy trust, it builds it, one act at a time." When she finished, the room erupted in applause, not out of obligation but genuine respect. Adrian joined her on stage, shaking her hand, his expression filled with something beyond professional appreciation, and perhaps the quiet recognition that courage had saved them both. That night, as Chantel walked home, she thought of the girl she used to be, the one who hid behind her screen, afraid of being noticed, afraid of being wrong. That version of herself had once believed invisibility was safety. Now she knew better. Safety wasn't silence, it was truth, and truth didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered through the right words, spoken at the right time, by someone brave enough to care.